That's another error. Private constructor, it is a default constructor, but it's written as a private constructor. That's another error. Default constructor is called with parentheses. That's error. And 6, okay, no such function, so it takes a different parameter. So segment C.
I have a question. If we say that function f is void, then do we still need a return statement, or is it okay if we don't have one?
You have to write void.
For it to be not an error?
Yes. If you don't write anything other than, if it's not a constructor, you have to write void or some return type.
There's no return type. I mean, yeah, there's no return type, then there has to be a
void.
return.
If there's no return type, it's a compile error.
As long as it doesn't say void, there has to be a return type.
Yes. So void is a return type, in other words. If the function doesn't return anything. Okay, segment C. We have a function integer, returns integer, takes integer a, this is a default value. Yes, okay, so return a. So function returns a reference integer, takes a reference integer a, returns a. Main function, we create an integer a. Call a function. Doesn't provide any. We don't provide any arguments. Do we have a definition for this function call?
No.
Okay, but what about this? So that's a default value, right? So a function argument, if you just assign something to it, if you don't provide an argument to that function, that default value will be used for that argument. And I can just call a function like this, in this case. So there's actually a function definition which supports this function call. This one, I can resolve it. But what about this part, left-hand side? Another function call, and this function call takes an argument a. Which one am I going to call?
Don't know.
So it's ambiguous. So you can't resolve either this one or this one. So this one is a reference, but still, if you just have, if you don't have this one, let's say, if you have this one, there won't be a problem because this function call will be resolved to be this function. But this will create a problem in that case.
Is the assignment legal?
Yes, if this function returns a reference integer, you can just assign some integer to it. Okay, so that reference will be used. That's the only case where you can call a function like this. If that function returns a reference, you can call it on the left-hand side as a left value. So the only problem with that segment is that ambiguous function call. So you have a function which takes an integer, you have the same function which takes an integer reference. If you pass an integer to a function call like that, it's ambiguous. You can just call it. Segment D. We have a class A. We have a private integer data, public. We have a constructor, takes an integer a as an argument. This is an initialization section. Use. So yeah, that's one error. Okay, so basically, is this an error? The first question. Yeah. A is not a member, right? So, and you can do this with, if A is a member, you can do this. Otherwise, you can't do that. It has to be in the opposite way, right? So data parentheses A. That's what you do. Okay, in main function, I create an array of 5 elements. Each element is an A. I create another array of 4 elements. Each element is an A. And I assign A to B. I can't assign arrays. That's an error. But what about these creations? So can I create an array like this?
There's no constructor for it.
There's no default constructor. So that's why I can't just create an array of A objects. I have a constructor, but it takes an argument. So array assignment. So three problems. So do you think these kind of questions are harder than the output questions?
Just finding all the errors may be hard, but find some.
So I will not give you any information about number of errors, but okay, there are multiple errors in this program segment. I can say that. Find 2 of them, maybe. Just find 3 of them. So out of 4, find 3 of them. That will be enough for me. Okay, so I will have some definition section for the, I may, there's no guarantee. I can also have questions which you have to fill in gaps. So those gaps can be program gaps. So I can give you a couple of executions of the program and want you to complete the rest of the program so that it works. Small program segments. So let's try to answer these questions. What's the difference between a class and an object? You just have to write it in 2 sentences. What's the difference? A class is a definition. An object is just an instance created out of that definition. That's it. So why can't a static member function access to non-static member data? So you have a static member function and you have member data, which is non-static. Why can't a static member function access the non-static data? Okay, so let's say that it can access the data. So you created 2 objects out of that definition, class definition. If you create 2 objects, each object will have its own data, right? Since it's non-static. So, and let's say you want to access the data using the static function. Which one are you going to access? You can't just choose this, I'm going to access this object or that object. Since you can have many copies of that data, the static function cannot choose anything and any data amongst the created ones. So the static data cannot know anything about the objects, can just know about the static definitions. The static function is basically a standalone function, but it's defined in the class. So what's encapsulation? Information hiding. Here you're just going to say, okay, when we define a class, we use public, private sections, those things. Okay. So list 2 advantages of separating code as, okay, we haven't covered this. Did we say anything about header function, header files and CPP files? We haven't covered it yet, right? I remember talking about it though. Okay, well, I remember it. So when we talked about interface of a class, so when we use encapsulation, we have the public part and the private part. So the public section can be inserted in a different file and provided to the end user or the other programmers, and the private section is about implementation and can be stored as a CPP file. That's the part of encapsulation and information hiding. Okay. Anyway, so what's anonymous object?
A temporary object created using the constructor.
Yes, basically you don't have an identifier for it. You just explicitly call the constructor of the